Well, yet another person has come out and disrespected Nikola Jokic, and I'm not even a Denver fan, yet I get so sick and tired of the criticism this man receives on a continual basis for the dumbest of reasons. And the latest person to come out and criticize Nikola Jokic is none other than Gilbert Arenas. Now, Gilbert Arenas had a lot to say about Jokic, but for this video I'm only focusing in on his comments about Nikola Jokic's first MVP season, since he gets a lot wrong here and I'm going to talk about it, but I also feel like there's a general lack of understanding of why Nikola Jokic actually won the first MVP. A lot of people don't remember the circumstances why he won, and even a lot of the arguments or the reasons people give on why Nikola Jokic didn't deserve this MVP are incredibly wrong and not even the reasons people gave why he won the MVP, so I'm going to break it all down. As always, before I do, if you like this kind of video and you want to see me talk about more basketball related topics, please consider liking and subscribing. But to get into his comments, Gilbert Arenas was on Nightcap, he was talking with Shannon Sharpe. And I will say, before actually getting into this, I don't believe Shannon Sharpe agrees with basically any of what Gilbert Arenas had to say, because even for years I used to watch Undisputed when Shannon Sharpe used to debate Skip Bayless, and he used to defend Nikola Jokic like crazy. He used to say for years Nikola Jokic was the best big man in the league, and then he even started saying he's the best player in the league. But he used to always have these arguments with Skip Bayless, where Skip Bayless would say Embiid is the best, and Shannon Sharpe used to go out of his way to say no, it's Jokic. Anyway, so I just wanted to throw in that disclaimer that I don't think Shannon Sharpe agrees with basically any of what Gilbert Arenas had to say here. But I will say, the more I listen to Gilbert Arenas talk, he's definitely establishing a reputation for hating on foreign-born players. He even had some viral comments recently saying that the way to improve the NBA would be to ban all European players.
I know what they can do. Get rid of all the Europeans.
He was basically implying that the NBA got soft, particularly defensively, because of European players and how they're soft and this and that. And just the other day he was complaining about how US-born players get way more criticism than foreign-born players, saying that Luka Doncic deserves way more criticism than someone like Jason Tatum. But anyway, to get into his comments, they were all spurred by an NBA executive coming out saying Nikola Jokic winning his third MVP in 4 years isn't going to age well. Now, this is basically the reasoning that was used for every MVP Jokic has received. Even his first one, which I'm going to talk about, a lot of people said like, oh, that's not going to age well because he's not that caliber of player.
If Nikola Jokic wins the MVP, he's the worst player to win the MVP since Dave Cowens.
No.
So that argument was used, and then for the second year when he won back-to-back MVPs, that case was even stronger because people were saying like, oh, this is Steve Nash again, this isn't going to age well, like he's taking the MVP like Steve Nash did from better players like Kobe and Shaq. And then even last year, of course, that criticism was wild. I think a lot of people forget just how wild the criticism was for him last year. Like, it's a fraction of what it is this year, thankfully. Like, it's at least gone down after the man proved himself. And I think a lot of the criticism comes from the fact that most people just don't want to admit to themselves they don't really watch a lot of Denver Nuggets basketball. I think that's fine. I don't watch the most Denver Nuggets basketball because I'm not a Denver fan. Every time I watch this man play, the style of basketball is just beautiful. It reminds me of the Spurs basketball back in like the 2013-2014 season. Just the way basketball should be played. Very team-oriented, getting everyone involved, nobody holding onto the ball for too long. But anyway, enough about that. Let's hear the comments.
Now, I do understand when they say this about Jokic. Jokic is probably statistically, when it comes to overall game, the worst MVP winner. He's the worst MVP winner in the last 40 years. Why you say that? When you're talking about MVP, the guys outside of first and second place, their teams was first and second place. The people who won the MVP, their teams was first and second. When Jordan won it, his team record, they were 7th in the NBA. That year, he averaged 35, 6, 5, 3 steals. All-Star MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, scoring title, steals leader. That was the MVP. Historic year. Makes sense. Right? That makes sense. When Westbrook won it, his team had the 10th best record. Triple-double.
First
right?
time since Oscar Robertson is
He did something amazing. His team was 10th, but he did something that wasn't done since Oscar Robertson. When Jokic, in 2021, Jokic's team was 5th. He averaged 26, 8, and 10. What was the historic part of that? There was no historian. Oh, the big man almost had a triple-double. Let's give it to him. That's what the narrative was. A big man almost, not did, almost won the triple-double, and they gave it to him when his team record was like that.
So Gilbert Arenas is basically saying Nikola Jokic didn't deserve to win that first MVP because he didn't do anything historic, his record wasn't particularly great, but when you actually look at what he did, all of his arguments quickly fall flat. But first of all, his main argument is a straw man argument, because that was never the main argument for Jokic winning MVP, is that he almost averaged a triple-double. Sure, like maybe a couple of people who voted for MVP might have said that, but when you actually look into the reasons why he won MVP, it just doesn't make any sense. For one, his main argument is that Jokic didn't do anything historic, like averaging 26.4 points, 10.8 rebounds, and 8.3 assists isn't historic? Like, how many other players have averaged 26, 10, and 8? There's only two others in the history of the league, Westbrook and Oscar Robertson. But I think Gilbert Arenas is looking at it saying like, oh, it wasn't a triple-double. A lot of people were like, oh, it was close, so let's give it to him. But no, let's actually get into the season and examine why he won. So the first major reason why he won the MVP is because of stats. Now, Gilbert Arenas may want to dismiss 26, 10, and 8, and keep in mind, I'm actually rounding down, I could round up, but as I mentioned, only two other players have ever done that in the history of the league, Oscar Robertson and Westbrook, and neither did it on Jokic's insane efficiency. Jokic shot 57% from the field, 39% from 3, and 87% from the foul line, which, for a center, those numbers are ridiculous, let alone any player. So in the history of the league, only two other people have put up a stat line even somewhat comparable, and yet nobody has done it on even 52% field goal percentage, let alone 57%. Yet Gilbert Arenas would have you believe that this was not historic, somebody doing something that had never been done in the history of the league. Also, while it wasn't 10 assists and he didn't average a triple-double, you can't simply dismiss 8 assists and what they represent from a center. Keep in mind, this is a center, like Westbrook and Oscar Robertson were obviously guards. So seeing Jokic as a center run an offense as efficiently as he did, with not nearly the same usage rate that the others had, was literally something that we've never seen in the history of the league, a center running an offense like that, with that efficiency. And not only were the basic counting stats historic, but the advanced stats were also historic. Now I know not everyone likes advanced stats, and I can understand, I think that they maybe get overused a little bit, but at the same time they at least paint part of a picture. They should be used in conjunction with the eye test, team success, the basic stats. Like, you should never use them simply on their own, but I do think they can help understand how a player is doing. Especially when you look at all the all-time greats, basically every single one of them ranks at the very top of all the advanced stats, so they must be onto something. But Jokic led the league in all the major advanced stats. He led the league in PER, player efficiency rating, win shares, offensive win shares, box plus minus, and value over replacement player, including a lot of the more abstract advanced stats. Not only that, but some of the other accomplishments he had, such as he led the league in double-doubles. He racked up 60 double-doubles on the year. Keep in mind it was only a 72-game year because it was a slightly shortened season. While finishing just second to Westbrook for triple-doubles on the season with 16 triple-doubles. Keep in mind, for a center getting a triple-double, that's even more insane because of the assist. So these were clearly historic stats worthy of an MVP. Now I want to take a moment to target one of Gilbert Arenas' biggest criticisms against Jokic this season, was that the stats weren't historic enough, but the reason that he's using that argument is because he doesn't think that the record was good enough. Now, looking at the Nuggets team record, I think it's important to understand some context. Because Gilbert Arenas is simply throwing out he had the 5th best record in the league, like that somehow disqualifies him from winning the MVP. Which, by the way, players in the past have won the MVP with significantly worse records. Some of the more notable examples are when Kareem won in the 75-76 season with a losing record, or in the 78-79 season when Moses Malone won with the 4th seed in his own conference. Now maybe you could say that was back when players voted. What about when media members started voting, which happened in the 1980 season? And just in the 1981-82 season, Moses Malone won yet again, and this time he had the 6th seed in his own conference, which was even lower than the last time he won. Or you can look at the 87-88 season when Michael Jordan won with the 3rd best record in his conference, tied for the 4th best record actually. Now, That's not to say none of these players deserve to win, since that's not at all what I'm saying. I'm simply saying that they set a precedent, which then other players like Russell Westbrook were able to follow, and then Nikola Jokic, where you didn't necessarily need to be a top seed. Now, there were other examples out there. These were just the more notable ones. But Jokic led the Nuggets to the 3rd seed in the Western Conference with a record of 47-25. Now, it is important to understand that this was a shortened season, so they only played in 72 games that year, so he won 65% of his games, which would be on pace for a 54-win season in a normal 82-game season. So again, 54 wins in a normal season would be more than sufficient enough to qualify you for the MVP. Now, of course, you would need other things, such as great stats and a good narrative, which, by the way, Jokic had. But Gilbert Arenas is somehow acting like this is a bad record, where you would need to average a triple-double like Russell Westbrook to overcome that bad record in the MVP. Also, something that's important to understand, which I doubt that Gilbert Arenas is aware about, is that Nikola Jokic actually started in every single game of the season, all 72. He was one of only 11 players that year to do that, and if you don't think MVP voters care about your availability, you are wrong. And I'll discuss that a little bit more when I look at some of the other MVP candidates in just a second. But something Gilbert Arenas also doesn't mention, because I'm pretty sure he doesn't know anything about it, and it's fine if you don't know everything about every team, but if you're going to throw out a strong opinion about something, you better have your facts right. But a big part of the narrative around Nikola Jokic this season was how injured his team was this season. Injuries were a big thing he was dealing with for both of the MVP seasons. The Denver Nuggets had an absurd amount of injuries this year. Now, Jamal Murray, who's obviously Nikola Jokic's best teammate, he would unfortunately go down with a season-ending injury that would also cause him to miss the next season. So Jamal Murray only played in 48 games. So that was something Jokic had to overcome. And if you don't think that that's important to his MVP case, the fact that the Nuggets were missing their second best player for a big part of the season, you're definitely wrong. And it wasn't like Jamal Murray was the only player that they were missing. As I mentioned, the Nuggets were dealing with a lot of injuries. Will Barton missed a lot of the season, PJ Dozier, a lot of other players. Do people not remember the Nuggets having to play players like Campazzo and Austin Rivers major minutes, especially leading into the playoffs? I mean, no disrespect to Campazzo, since I really liked him as a player, but Campazzo and Austin Rivers should not be getting major minutes on your team. So the fact that Nikola Jokic led his team to this record, which by the way is good, while playing every single game, putting up historic numbers on historic efficiency, missing a lot of key players and surrounded by a lack of talent, if you don't think that that's a good MVP case, I don't know what to tell you. So I believe I've established that Jokic had a very good MVP case, but it's also important to look at some of the other deserving MVP candidates, because with basically every season of the NBA, you have multiple deserving MVP candidates. Unfortunately, only one of them can win the award. Now, Jokic would end up being the runaway winner of the award, claiming 91 of the 101 first place votes, but let's look at some of the other teams, specifically with better records and some of the MVP candidates. First, the Jazz finished with the best record in the league. Unfortunately for them, they didn't really have a serious MVP candidate, despite Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert obviously having very good seasons. So moving on to the Suns, who also had a better record. The problem with the Suns' MVP candidates is that they had two MVP candidates, so they kind of narratively took from each other. Now, Devin Booker was actually kind of pushed out of the MVP conversation, and instead Chris Paul was the one propped up to have the MVP case. Now, Chris Paul's case for MVP was mostly narrative-based. It wasn't so much looking at advanced stats and different things like that. Instead, it was more so the fact that the team went from not making the playoffs in the previous season to the second best record in the league. But at the same time, it was kind of hard to justify giving him the award when he averaged 16, 4, and 9. Although I still believe he was a deserving MVP candidate, it's just hard when you have many other players averaging some of the most absurd numbers. So Chris Paul would end up finishing 5th, and also something that's important to note is that compared to the other MVP candidates such as Jokic and Giannis and Embiid, he only had a few more wins, so it wasn't like his record was significantly better. Moving on to the 76ers, who also had a better record. Now, Joel Embiid had a great year and would finish 2nd in MVP voting. He was definitely a worthy MVP candidate. He would average 28.5 points, 10.6 rebounds, which overall was very comparable to Jokic's numbers, but where we see the major difference in Jokic's favor is in the 2.8 assists Embiid averaged, which obviously isn't close to Jokic's over 8 assists per game. Not to mention Embiid put up these numbers on worse efficiency than Jokic had. While he was still very efficient, shooting 51% from the field, Jokic's 57% was more impressive, not to mention all the advanced stats in Jokic's favor. The primary argument Embiid had over Jokic was the fact that his team had a better record. The 76ers finished with the best record in the East. However, voters tend to care more about what your actual team record is as opposed to where you finish in the standings, because they kind of acknowledge that depending on how competitive your conference is, your seeding may vary, such as a 50-win team in one conference could finish with like the 6th best record, while if they were in the other conference, it may have been the 2nd or even the best record. So when comparing the 76ers and Nuggets records, there was only 2 wins separating them, so that alone wasn't really enough to help Embiid. But at the end of the day, what really hurt Embiid's case was availability. This actually became a big problem for a lot of the MVP candidates. From week to week, it felt like we had a new MVP frontrunner, as some of the frontrunners throughout the season would go down with injuries. But Embiid had some availability issues and he would finish playing just 51 games, which would be about 70% of the season. Now obviously this was before the 65 game rule, so it didn't disqualify him. But had Embiid played 70% of a normal season, it would come out to about 58 games played. So it just isn't really enough to warrant giving him the award, unless he is so much better in the other areas than the other MVP candidates. Not to mention his main competition and the guy who ended up beating him out for the award played in every single one of the games, so that obviously really helped Jokic's case. Now looking at the only other team that had a better record, that was the Nets. Now James Harden had a pretty good MVP case for a fraction of the year. The problem with James Harden is he would have some injuries and would only finish playing 44 games on the year, so he was never going to win. So I believe I've shown that nobody with a better record than the Nuggets had a better MVP case, but what about some of the other MVP candidates? Because Giannis and Curry would have great MVP cases. Now looking at Giannis, he finished 4th in MVP voting, and he had a great year. He averaged 28, 11, and 6. But his record was worse than in previous seasons, so that didn't really help him. And his record was not quite as good as the Nuggets. Now, it wasn't a big difference, it was only a game difference, but it's not like his record helped him in his case against Jokic. So when you look at the fact that Jokic had a slightly better record with less help, that obviously really helped Jokic, not to mention all the advanced stats and the efficiency were in Jokic's favor. Their stats were fairly comparable. Jokic's might have been slightly higher, but for the most part, they had pretty comparable stats. Now, there's a belief that Giannis only didn't win the award because of voter fatigue or the fact that it would have been 3 straight MVPs. I don't believe that that's as big of a factor as a lot of people make it out to be. Now, while I still think it was somewhat of a factor, I don't think that that was the only reason why he lost to Jokic. In fact, when you just look at their 2 MVP cases without any sort of context on who's won it in the past and stuff like that, I genuinely believe Jokic had the stronger case, of course. Slightly better record, less help, better efficiency. So I kind of look at that and I say, like, even without voter fatigue, Jokic had a slightly better case. Now, where I will say voter fatigue definitely hurt Giannis was where he finished in the MVP case. I don't think he should have finished 4th. I probably would have had him 2nd, especially with how few games Embiid played. But again, I often see that thrown out there that in this particular season, Giannis had the better case, when I think he had a great case, but I don't think it was quite as good as Jokic's. Now, Steph Curry was the only other major competition, and he would finish 3rd in MVP voting, and while 32, 5, and 6 is a phenomenal year, it would be hard to justify giving him the award when the Warriors finished 8th in their own conference with the 14th best